The draft Energy Intensive Industry Electricity Support Payments and Levy Amendment to Regulations 2026.
I call the Minister to move the motion. Minister Chris MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I beg to move that the committee approve these regulations. This instrument was laid on the 12th of January 2026. I'd like to acknowledge the Joint Committee on Statutory Instruments, who have provided helpful review of these regulations and not drawn any special attention of this House and the other place to these instruments. I would like to acknowledge that the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee have reported these statutory instruments as instruments of interest to members. This instrument aims to deliver one of the Government's commitments, including within the Modern Industrial Strategy, to increase electricity price support to energy-intensive industries, or EEIs, through the British Industry Supercharger. Energy-intensive industries include foundational manufacturing sectors which are critical to the UK's economic security and the delivery of the Modern Industrial Strategy. These include steel, chemicals, cement, electrical components and gigafactories. The British Industry Supercharger was introduced in 2024 to reduce the electricity price gap between Great Britain and comparable industrial countries in Western Europe, such as France, Germany and the Netherlands. The supercharger is made up of 3 measures. The Energy Intensive Industry Exemption Scheme, which offers 100% exemption from contracts for difference, feed-in tariff and renewables obligation electricity policy levies. The Capacity Market Exemption, which offers 100% exemption from the costs of funding the electricity capacity market. And the Network Charging Compensation Scheme, which provides 60% compensation on an energy-intensive industry's electricity network costs. While the supercharger package of measures has been successful, the Government recognised that there remains an electricity price gap between Great Britain and comparable industrial economies in Europe, which places British energy-intensive industries at a competitive disadvantage whilst increasing the risk of carbon leakage and the offshoring of vital manufacturing jobs and investment. That is why in the Government's Modern Industrial Strategy we included the commitment to increase the level of relief offered by the Network Charging Compensation Scheme from 60% to 90%. This will reduce electricity bills for currently supported energy-intensive industries by a further £7 to £10 per megawatt hour, bringing the total reduction to between £65 to £87 per megawatt hour, and we will deliver up to £420 million of electricity price support per annum. These regulations aim to further close the electricity price gap, ensuring that British foundational manufacturing is able to thrive and grow. It will help ensure that the 550 companies that currently benefit from the scheme will continue to be able to attract new investment and preserve well-paid jobs and crucial supply chains across Britain's manufacturing heartlands. These regulations amend the Electricity Support Payments and Levy Regulations 2024 to make provision for increasing the level of relief offered through the Network Charging Compensation Scheme. In conclusion, these regulations will help reduce electricity costs for the most energy and trade-intensive industries such as steel, chemicals, cement and battery manufacturers. They will help to reduce the risk of carbon leakage by helping to retain critical manufacturing investment and jobs in Britain. I commend these regulations to the committee.
Thank you, Minister. The question is that the committee has considered the draft Energy-Intensive Industry Electricity Support Payments and Levy Amendment Regulations 2026. I call the opposition spokesperson, Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Vaz. A pleasure, as ever, to serve under your chairmanship. Energy-intensive industries have long been the backbone of our industrial economy, from steel and chemicals to ceramics and refining. These sectors provide skilled jobs, anchor local communities and guarantee our economic security. Yet they are operating in an increasingly hostile environment, driven largely by the cost of energy. This statutory instrument makes limited but important amendments to the existing energy-intensive industry electricity support payments regime. Specifically, it increases the level of compensation available under the Network Charging Compensation Scheme, as the Minister has said, from 60% to 90% from April 2026, and extends the application window from 1 month to 2. These changes are made using powers under the Energy Act 2023 and are intended to strengthen the British Industry Supercharger package. The stated aim is to lower electricity costs for the most energy-intensive sectors, reduce the risk of carbon leakage, and help retain manufacturing investment and jobs here in the United Kingdom. So the opposition will always welcome measures that provide greater clarity and modest additional support for industries under pressure. However, it is impossible to consider this instrument in isolation from the wider context. Britain's industrial electricity prices are among the highest in the world. On a price per kilowatt hour basis, our electricity costs are the most expensive in the G7 and the European Union, around 46% higher than the median. Industrial electricity prices here are around 4 times higher than in the United States and roughly 50% more expensive than in France and Germany. As my honourable friend in other debates, the member for Aberdeenshire and Kincardine, has rightly said, government policy risks accelerating the deindustrialisation of this country, from the potteries in Stoke to the Prax Lindsay oil refinery in Lincolnshire, and most... Of course.
Gareth Snell.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I never miss an opportunity to talk about ceramics. The Honourable Gentleman for Mid Buckinghamshire, when he listed out the sectors that this helps, he said ceramics. Now, he will surely know, given this was a scheme that was set up by his government, that the ceramic sector isn't covered by the supercharger scheme. The product SIT codes that were specifically listed when this set up excluded ceramic manufacturers. Can you tell me why his government then decided that ceramics were not entitled to the level of support that he was putting in place for other energy-intensive industries?
The Honourable Gentleman is right to raise that, and I've always been impressed on a cross-party basis of the passion with which he speaks for industry in his own constituency. The point of the speech that I am trying to set out here is actually to talk to those industries that don't currently have the support. I've noticed he is bobbing to try and catch your eye, Mrs. Vaz, and I'm sure perhaps he will have some helpful comments for the Minister on that front when he does come to make his remarks. But the point that I'm very much making is one of the wider context that we have got to see this statutory instrument within. Most glaringly, the emissioning the oil and gas industry in the North Sea. Energy-intensive industries are not just struggling, they are being driven overseas by costs they simply cannot absorb. They're being driven overseas. The very thing the Minister in his opening remarks was trying to argue he was trying to prevent from happening is happening. Since Labour came into government, more than 15,000 manufacturing and industrial jobs have already been lost, largely because of astronomical energy costs combined with unnecessary green levies and carbon taxes. When manufacturing moves abroad, we do not eliminate emissions, we simply offshore them, often to countries like China with weaker environmental standards and far greater geopolitical risk. We have also heard clear warnings from industry leaders. Sir Jim Ratcliffe has been explicit that high taxes and energy costs have left sites such as Grangemouth unable to compete with overseas rivals. These are not abstract concerns, they are real decisions affecting real jobs. Against that backdrop, while these regulations make proportionate and technical changes, they do not address the fundamental problem. Increasing compensation within a flawed system is not the same as fixing the system itself. The best way to reduce electricity prices for energy-intensive businesses is to tackle costs at source by scrapping the energy profits levy and removing punitive carbon taxes that undermine competitiveness. I would therefore be grateful if the Minister could clarify how this statutory instrument fits into a broader, long-term strategy for energy-intensive industries. Does he accept that compensation schemes, whilst welcome, cannot substitute for structural reform of energy pricing? And can he assure the committee that the government is developing a plan that genuinely restores Britain's industrial competitiveness? Ultimately, energy-intensive industries know that their future depends on predictable, affordable energy. If we are serious about growth, resilience and security, the government must ensure that our policies of this country enable these industries to survive and thrive here at home and not drive them abroad.
You caught my eye. Gareth Snell.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Hudson. Can I start by thanking the Minister for his engagement on this issue, particularly with the sector in Stoke-on-Trent and around the country that I talk about quite a lot in terms of ceramics, because this is an area where actually the increasingly large cost of energy is a real impediment to us. And the perverse situation is that when this scheme was set up, and I welcome the scheme and I welcome the changes to the scheme to give a greater relief to energy-intensive industry, but when this scheme was set up, the way this scheme is funded isn't through taxpayers' money in the traditional sense of government handing out a grant. It is in fact a levy. This is a levy placed on the licensed electrical generator suppliers that is then used to compensate other sectors of energy-intensive industry. So this is about consumers in one sector paying a higher bill to help subsidise the cost of others. And again, from a redistributive perspective, I can see why that would work. But because the way in these regulations were written, the product SITCos to which as a sector or industry can access the supercharger scheme is incredibly narrow. It does include steel, it does include cement, it does include things that absolutely are foundational to the successful manufacturing in this country. But the perverse thing is if you're not in the supercharger, you are paying a slightly higher bill to help those that are in the supercharger. So if you are in an energy-intensive industry such as ceramics, your bill every month is slightly higher than it would be to help pay for other energy-intensive industries to have lower bills. And that is an anomaly that was set up in the system, and it is one that I don't think was intentional. I really don't, but it is one that means that places like Stoke-on-Trent are essentially subsidising the steel mills in Scunthorpe and the cement manufacturers and the brick manufacturers in some places. And that's something that I hope the Minister will take away from this, that by extending this scheme, as well as extending the threshold of deductions that can be made, extending the scheme to who can access it would be an incredibly useful and powerful way of demonstrating support for foundational manufacturing sectors like ceramics that are key to our national defence, to our house building programme, to our gift and tableware exports, which provide a balance of treatment in favour of the UK because of what we produce and where we send it to, but also to those advanced ceramics that are used in telecommunications, in bioindustry, in refractories that are needed for glass making and ceramic making, and the new emerging ceramic technologies that are going to be used in these small modular reactors for plating turbine blades at Rolls-Royce. There are a whole sector of our industry that currently doesn't get this support. So I do wonder if the Minister will be able to say about any thoughts he may have about extending the scheme. The second point I wanted to make on this, Madam Chair, is that to access this support, you have to demonstrate through the business level test that 20% of your GVA is taken up on electricity. For some energy-intensive industries, they're never going to reach that because they have gas as a component of their energy costs. And again, the ceramic sector is a huge example of that. Massively energy-intensive, but predominantly gas-based. So we wouldn't. So there has to be a change, I would suggest to the Minister, in how he applies the energy cost calculation for GVA to access this scheme to include both gas and electricity, even if the discount only comes on electricity. Because there are producers in the ceramic sector who would dearly love to move towards electrification of kilns and would move towards electrifying products that are currently gas-powered. But the disproportionately high cost of electricity means that that is not economical for them. And even if they were to do that, they would still fall foul of the business level test because so much gas is still needed. So they could have the double whammy of a higher electricity bill and still have to pay for gas. And as costs increase on a variety of other areas, not least raw materials being bought, for some companies who I know are in the current supercharger scheme, that 20% threshold is becoming closer and closer to 19% because it's a proportion of the overall cost. So has the Minister thought about whether that 20% threshold is something that needs to be considered in future amendments to make sure that we don't inadvertently see people fall out of the supercharger scheme because the energy costs of their company becomes a smaller proportion of the overall cost as other costs grow, not because their electricity costs come down? And finally, if I can, Madam Chair, the government, I understand, is going to be using genuine public money in this instance to make up the difference between the 60% and the 90% threshold. If it transpires that the demand for this is such that that amount of money available doesn't meet the necessary additional costs that are being saved by those companies that will have that new 90% reduction, is there any mechanism to stop the electricity suppliers putting up their tariffs on the other energy-intensive users to compensate for that loss of that difference in what they're receiving from the government to compensate their loss and what they're passing on to their suppliers? Because again, potentially we could have the perverse system where a greater level of discount is given to some energy-intensive suppliers, but places like ceramics and companies in Stoke-on-Trent pay an even larger electricity bill in order to meet that. But overall, the intention, I know, of the Minister is good. The intention of this statutory instrument today is good. I think there are some nuances that we can work on, and if you were willing to consider extending the scheme to include the ceramic sector, there'd be a lot of happy potters in Stoke-on-Trent.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. Given that, as we've heard, British manufacturers do face some of the highest industrial electricity prices in the world, it is right that the government recognises this pressure this puts on sectors like steel, chemicals and glass, and I very much do hope that we'll hear from the Minister that he's taking into consideration my honourable member's plea for the inclusion or exemption for ceramics. An energy-intensive industries often operate in highly competitive international markets and cannot simply pass on costs. And as the Minister said, without support, we risk carbon leakage, the loss of investment, and the erosion of the UK's foundational manufacturing base. So measures that help keep production and jobs in Great Britain are therefore welcome. However, while this support will be a relief for large energy users, it highlights a persistent imbalance in how energy costs are being treated across the wider economy. And we must remember that businesses of all sizes are struggling with high and volatile energy prices. And it is those that are most acutely felt by small and medium-sized enterprises. And small businesses are at the heart of our economy and the heart of our local communities. Yet many remain exposed to volatile energy costs as a result of both our over-dependence on volatile fossil fuel prices, but also the delay in electricity market reforms to stop energy bills being treated like a credit card for the whole transition. And SMEs have been afforded limited protection. When the previous energy bill relief scheme ended in 2023, Liberal Democrats estimated that over 3 million SMEs saw their energy bills rise by a combined £7.6 billion, and that pressure has not gone away. So we welcome Ofgem's move to extend access to the Energy Ombudsman to smaller SMEs, but many businesses remain without meaningful routes to challenging unfair or incorrect bills, especially if they have over 50 employees. So the energy transition is the right way forward. I've just come this morning from a visit to NISO HQ, where they literally keep the lights on. I've seen in real time the shift that's already happened to renewables and clean energy, and it's critical for energy security to stop us being dependent on either Putin's Russia or Trump's America for keeping the lights on. But this final point is, whilst the scheme is funded through a levy on suppliers, as my honourable member mentioned here, we have some concerns. And whilst the government states that households and small businesses will not see higher bills, the government must stop the delay and bring forward the electricity market reform so that we have assurances that this will not fall on consumers with higher prices, giving with one hand whilst taking from the other. So, whilst we recognise the case for supporting energy-intensive industries, we remain concerned about the absence of comparable support for SMEs and the potential cost to consumers.
Thank you very much, Ms. Vaz, and I'll be very brief in my comments. And I won't seek to reiterate what the Shadow Minister has so eloquently set out, or indeed what the Honourable Member for Stoke-on-Trent Central has set out. But what I do think they've both illustrated, as indeed did the Honourable Lady, the spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats, set out, is that the intention behind this is something to be welcomed, is the right thing. However, there is a considerable amount of complexity in this and how it will play out over time. And so therefore my one point is to take the Minister to paragraph 47 of the impact assessment, bullet point 3, where it refers to the policy needing to be reviewed at an appropriate juncture. I think that's sensible, but could he set out what an appropriate juncture would look like?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It's very pleasing to see that there's a reasonable level of support, I think, across the House, not only for this measure, but also for our energy-intensive industries. And perhaps I could answer the question for the member for Malton and Siston, whilst also talking at length about ceramics, my honourable friend, and for the members for Stoke-on-Trent Central, because both he and I enjoy that. So there is a general review of the eligibility for the supercharger planned this coming year. And that would certainly be the opportunity to look at eligibility for other sectors. And I've said previously, and I'm happy to say again to my honourable friend, the member for Stoke-on-Trent Central, that I have tasked my officials with looking very carefully at the case for inclusion of the ceramics industry. And perhaps just to expand on that, so the current qualification for the supercharger system is related both to energy intensity and also to the risk of export leakage. As he will be aware, the ceramics industry is, well, in fact, as he said, the ceramics industry is very gas intensive, and so I think that this is possibly why the ceramics industry's fallen below the threshold previously, but of course we do want the ceramics industry to electrify, and that difference between gas and electricity costs is of course a concern for the industry. He also asked the question as well about the funding for the scheme, and again, to be clear, we don't expect there to be any increase in non-domestic or domestic bills as a consequence of this change, and partially as a result of the change between RPI and CPI and the renewables obligation and the feed-in tariff. So essentially by bearing down on costs in the system is how we propose to pay for this change. The member for South Cambridgeshire talked very well, I think, about the challenge for small businesses. And as I'm sure she'll understand, over the last few months I've laid out some improvements in energy costs for the energy-intensive industry to the supercharger, for manufacturing more generally through the British Industrial Competitiveness Scheme. Some of those manufacturing businesses will be small businesses, but I appreciate she was talking more widely about the small business sector. I also am concerned about that as well, and I'm leaving no stone unturned to see how we can ultimately help all businesses across the country with their energy costs. But I think that really comes back to the general point that the Shadow Minister was making, which is about the level of uncompetitive energy that we have in the UK more generally, and fundamentally this policy is designed to provide a measure of support as a consequence of that. So I'm very grateful for the Shadow Minister's welcoming of the change in the regulations. And also he described energy-intensive industries as the backbone of our economy. I could not agree more with that sentiment, having worked in the steel industry myself for so long. It's so nice to hear such warm words from industry, even though if I do feel that the opposition are perhaps a bit of a late convert to this. I know that the former Prime Minister himself scrapped industrial strategy. He wasn't keen on it. A previous Conservative Prime Minister was, so that's nice, but maybe we have consensus around industrial policy now, and that's a very pleasing thing to see. I mean, he described the environment around energy as a hostile environment, and really I would sort of thank him really for laying out so clearly the failure of his government's energy policy. I mean, ultimately this was as a result of our reliance on gas in the system, and it might be a fact that the opposition are not keen to acknowledge, but the cheapest forms of energy are solar, onshore wind and offshore wind. Fundamentally, they are the cheapest forms of energy available to us, but more than that, they create demand for these foundational industries in those industries as well. They also offer great jobs as well. We've outlined an increase of 400,000 jobs in the clean energy industries, really good jobs for people across the whole of the country, and of course they offer energy security as well, so homegrown energy. And whilst many members across the House, not only on our own side of the House, but of course Liberal Democrats as well, are very content to bask in the warm glow of solar power, onshore wind and offshore wind, I appreciate that the opposition are feeling a chill breeze up their right flank and tacking essentially to the tacking across to the climate denying policies of reform. But really that can't be the basis on which an energy policy is determined in the country. We need to focus instead on low cost energy for consumers and industry, for energy security and good jobs, and that's what renewable energy delivers. And through this mechanism we'll ensure that our energy intensive industries continue to be competitive in Europe for that period of time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The question is that the committee has considered the draft Energy Intensive Industry Electricity Support Payments and Levy Amendment Regulations 2026. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order.